without further ado, we're going to now move on to our next speaker. Let me just introduce him with a couple of words. So our next speaker is Ian Lockey. Ian got his BA in Classics from Cambridge University and his PhD from NYU, where he completed a dissertation entitled The Atrium House at Aphrodisias Caria. After a 2-year stint as a postdoc fellow at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, he began his job at Friends Select School in Philadelphia, where he has taught middle and high school Latin, ancient Greek, Greek mythology, and Arabic. He teaches Latin at his school with a focus on social justice and the reception of the ancient world, and I'm very pleased to introduce him now with the talk entitled Confronting Raised Difficulties Through Reading Reflections. So Ian's slides, by the way, are on the website that you can go and consult yourself. Now I'm going to focus on Ian. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you to Hannah and Joe for organizing this conference and for accepting my paper. And thank you to Brett for a really amazing first paper of the day. I'm just going to share my screen to put the slides up, and then I'll get started. Okay. So the discipline we study is one of contradictions. There is so much beauty in the ancient world, from literature to art and architecture, and so much to be amazed by, down to the seemingly mundane, daily life objects that archaeologists turn up regularly. But it is also a discipline whose very existence is almost inextricably enmeshed with white supremacy, elitism, sexism, and racism, both at the academic level and in the world at large. We teach a subject that has been weaponized to exclude and diminish, from the work of scholars like Victor Davis Hanson to Identity Europa. This happens openly. For example, Donald Trump's executive order to have federal buildings be built in the neoclassical style, or bigoted attacks on people truthfully asserting that statues were painted or that the Roman Empire was incredibly diverse. But it also takes place in subtler ways, with messaging of happy slaves in textbooks, and histories of anyone but elite men largely absent from frequently cited scholarship. For change to take place in the field, we need to take ownership of the problems in the discipline. And I say hopefully, much incredible work is now being done, as this conference attests. To enact change, the students who are currently studying Latin from middle school through the college level need to also engage with issues in the field. And when their love of studying the ancient world drives them to become classicists beyond undergraduate study, they need to bring their passion for justice and equity to the academy and to their own teaching. Inspired by this vision for change, 2 years ago, I radically overhauled the Latin curriculum in my high school. I'm the only high school Latin teacher at my Quaker school. I have a middle school colleague who is equally driven to mold critically astute students focused on social justice. And so I teach some students 4 years in a row. As a disclaimer, my students are predominantly white, although that trend has started to change for the better in recent years. But unfortunately, we teach in a discipline that is also predominantly white. And I believe it is just as vital to educate white students about their privilege to be able to and need to make a difference, as it is to open the field to other much needed perspectives. As it stands, my Latin 2 course continues the study of grammar through the subjunctive, the ablative absolute, the passive periphrastic, preparing students to tackle unabridged Latin texts in Latin 3. As a Quaker school, we do not require the AP exam, and I am lucky as an independent school teacher to have total freedom in creating a curriculum. Our Quaker mission is one that is focused on teaching and promoting social justice in the tradition of the Society of Friends. And that was one of my guiding principles in crafting this new course of study. My Latin 3 class is a class on Roman women, engaging with ideas of gender, misogyny, oppression, sexual violence, and empowerment in the ancient world and today. We read excerpts from Livy, Catullus, Sulpicia, and the Laudatio Turiae, as well as epitaphs and works in translation. We look at modern gender theory, and we think about representations of women in art, both in the ancient world and today. In tandem with this, we have our own book club where we work through Donna Zuckerberg's Not All Dead White Men. My Latin 4 class focuses on the imperialism and tyranny in the figure of Augustus. We read the Res Gestae and excerpts from Suetonius, Tacitus, Vitruvius, Orosius, and Mussolini's Codex. We think about ideas of empire, both in the ancient world and today, and methods of political control, misinformation, and architectural propaganda. My Latin 5 class is a race and ethnicity class, in which we read excerpts from Juvenal, Tacitus, Caesar, and Vitruvius, and discuss definitions of racism and prejudice, ideas of racial construction and its intersection with power, and the ways in which ancient ideas of environmental determinism and othering have been received in the modern world and have contributed to modern racism. We also have a book club where we read Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. At all levels, we discuss issues of the reception of the ancient world and think about the ways in which ancient culture has been perverted to shape and bolster white supremacist structures and viewpoints. We engage openly with the opportunities the field provides, but also with the problems within the field that still need our attention. In this way, my students are introduced not only to the ancient world and the numerous ways in which one can forge a career connected to its study, but also to current issues within the field being debated within academia and beyond it. The topics that we cover are difficult ones. Many times they require trigger warnings. They also require sophisticated and nuanced engagement, which is a skill that high school students are still developing. I firmly believe that these are conversations that students at the high school level should be having and are capable of having. Thinking of my own previous discomfort with such conversations and comments I have heard or read of others who have voiced nervousness about engaging with such topics, I would like to introduce a strategy that has made engaging with these ideas with students much less intimidating and in fact very rewarding and enlightening. Borrowing a technique from my Latin colleague who used this in middle school language arts classes, in order to allow for our discussions to be as open and honest as they can be, I give my students written responses to readings to complete before the class discussion period, rather than simply assigning readings to them or requiring them to annotate a piece. Whenever English readings are assigned, either of texts in translation, such as Livy, or articles from online sources, students are asked to read and write a response of 2 to 3 paragraphs, outlining their thoughts. Sometimes the responses are totally open, with students having freedom to write whatever they feel like in response to the text. But other times students are given a prompt to answer to help guide their reading of more difficult texts or to prepare students for more difficult discussions. I make it very clear to my students that these are discussions I am learning from also. I am not an expert in gender theory, issues of misogyny and sexism, anti-racism, or political corruption and oppression. I do think critically about these issues at all times, but just like my students, I am still on my own journey, reflecting on my own past actions, thinking about past and present injustice, and developing a strategy to contribute to future equity. Just as my students learn from me, I learn from my students, whose world is very different from the world I grew up in. I model vulnerability in discussion and admit past mistakes to make it known that we can share openly and without judgment. As it is through the exercise of organizing thoughts beforehand in writing that our conversations can become more complex, especially at the high school level. Students who are unfamiliar with or uncomfortable with a topic can share simply what they have written down. Not that students have to contribute depending on the topic that we're discussing. But students who have thought previously about or who have experienced firsthand issues we are discussing can build upon what they have written. This technique allows for everyone to be able to share something. And I have been dazzled by the brilliance of all of my students during these classroom sessions. The leaning of my student body is generally very liberal. And so often the responses are of a relatively cohesive nature, with differences arising based around familiarity with or interest in the topic. Given the diversity, equity, and inclusion work we do in general at the school, the students are well prepared to have conversations where issues may be controversial, difficult, or triggering. Our school DEI director has created amazing safe spaces to have discussions throughout the school divisions and throughout the school year. Our school's approach to these conversations is framed by a series of guidelines of assuming good intent, respecting people's voices, never speaking over someone, speaking from the I perspective, and leaning into discomfort. These are guidelines that I have built upon in the discussions in my class. There have not been major disagreements in our class discussions, but there have been differences of opinion, especially over gender issues, that are always dealt with respectfully for this very reason.